Hi everybody, today I'm going to be taking you through the setup of an Active Directory server on Windows Server 2012 R2. This is a fresh installed VM which I'm using for purposes of this demo. One thing I have done after the installation, I have changed the computer name. This is nice to do. Well, you have to do this before you start your AD setup, because once you've set up your server as an Active Directory, you can no longer change your computer name. You would do this by accessing the system properties, clicking on change settings over here, click change here, enter your new computer name, hit OK, reboot the server, and off you go. That's where we are now. Finished changing the computer name, just rebooted the server, so ready to rock and roll. First things first, you've got to start off by accessing the server manager. You can access it from this tab on the bottom here. It also opens up automatically when you log into the server as default, so it should pop up after you've installed your server first time and logged in. It should pop up and show you the server manager. So what we're going to start off with, we're going to add roles, and we're going to click on the add roles and features option. Here we've got a screen that's just going to give us a bit of info as to what you can do with the screen, etc. I like to skip this page in future. It's a little bit arbitrary information. As you click next, we're going to select role-based or feature-based installation. This is what we require to select the roles that we need to install for Active Directory. You can click on next. It's going to show you a list of servers here. Generally, you'll only select the current local server. In certain environments, you might have a whole list of servers here. In our environment, not so, because also the same process, you are able to deploy to more than one servers simultaneously, or to a server remotely, which would mean you would select a different server if it were listed here. So we're just going to stick to our current money-AV server, and we're going to click next. Here we have a list of services that we can select. Very important. Always select the domain services first, and this pop-up shows you all the required features to manage this service, all the tools, etc. You can go ahead and click add these features. What we also need to do along with domain services, we must install a DNS server. Very, very important. Same principle. Also allow the tools to be added. These are the two services we are going to be installing today. Once you've selected those two services, you can click on next. You'll be shown a screen with a bunch of features. We're not going to be ticking any of these features today, but here are a list of features which you can always add at a later stage once you've converted this server to an Active Directory server. One of the very important features you would probably be adding next is your Windows Server backup, but I'll tackle that in another video. So you can skip selecting any options here, click next to continue with the Active Directory domain services wizard. Here you're just getting a rundown of what these two services entail. Here it'll show you what Active Directory is all about, what you need to note, minimum requirements. Some of these you might not necessarily have immediately, and you can ignore that because during the installation process all these requirements will be met. Clicking next, this will just give you a rundown of your domain services, and as you see here, things to note: DNS server integration with Active Directory services automatically replicates DNS data along with other directory service data, making it easier to manage. So these two features, Active Directory domain services and DNS server, go hand in hand. They cannot function without each other. Well, DNS can function on its own, but Active Directory cannot function without DNS. Just click on next. Here it'll just give you a rundown of the services to be installed. You can select the option to restart the server automatically if required, or just hit install. Clicking this option will restart the server automatically once it's installed the services, which I think is a requirement after you've installed Active Directory. So we'll allow that, and then we'll hit install. here's the installation screen. We'll just watch this installation run through. Should go quite quickly. There you go. There we can see that the installation has been successful, and you now have a new link here which says promote the server to a domain controller. You can click on this link here, or you see the little yellow triangle at the top here. It's going to give you the option to start the same wizard. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on the close button to close off this window. Up here by the little notifications tab, if you click here, you'll get a new little box here that shows that this feature the feature installation has succeeded, and you now need to follow a secondary wizard to complete the installation. We're going to run through that now. So go ahead and click on promote the server to a domain controller. This will bring up your Active Directory Domain Services configuration wizard, where we are actually going to do the configuration of the domain that you want to set up. Here you have a couple of different options. You can add a domain controller to an existing domain. That would be if you are adding a backup domain controller or a secondary domain controller, whether it be on the same site or on a different site, you would select that option. You can also add a new domain to an existing forest, where you'll see you can specify child domain settings, etc. like this. Now there's a lot of conflict as to why you would add a new domain to an existing forest, possibly for management, different security strategies, etc. Typically, you wouldn't require adding a new domain to an existing forest. It doesn't make management any easier. There's no additional security features really that you gain from it. So just keeping your current domain in place, adding your UPN suffixes, and managing your domains with structured OU setup is probably your safest option. Obviously, that depends on your own personal preference. That's the way I prefer to do it, just managing it with a structured OU setup. And today we are going to be adding a new forest. So the first time you set up an Active Directory server on your network, you need to deploy a forest, which is a lovely little term that Microsoft have used, which encumbers your entire domain. Basically, your domain servers would act in a sense as trees within your forest, or clumps of trees, etc., and all encumbered under the same forest. So this Active Directory server will also be the primary domain controller. If you are adding a secondary domain controller, you can then split roles. There's 5 main roles which you can split between the Active Directory servers, and I'll also tackle those in a later video. So now we can go ahead and choose your domain name. We are going to select moneyacc.local for our domain name. The .local is just a neat way of disconnecting your internal domain from your external domain. If you wanted to, for instance, add your external domain here, if you added .co.za or a .com, bear in mind that in your DNS entries you would have to create external records pointing to your website, any external servers for that .com or .co.za or whatever public domain you've utilized, because your internal server will then become the DNS authority for that domain. Seeing as that a .local does not exist out on the internet, it is a safe domain to use or domain extension to use, so that you can easily segregate your internal domain from your external domain. You're more than welcome to use your publicly visible domain. It doesn't change any features or any security protocols, etc. like that. It just makes DNS slightly more a little more tricky. But if you're happy to add the extra records, etc., as and when needed, then go ahead, use your internal domain name. I'm going to stick with .local. It works for me the best. So go ahead and let's click on next. Here you will now be prompted for a couple of different settings for your domain, your forest function level and your domain function level. Depending on which level you choose will depend on what services or what servers are allowed on your network. Typically, it's best practice to always go with the most up-to-date forest and domain function level, especially if this is your first domain controller. If it is a secondary domain controller that you're adding to the network, I would recommend that you log on to Microsoft's knowledge base and make sure that you select the correct function and domain level applicable to your environment, as this may have certain restrictions on certain applications and domain servers, etc., certain security policies you have running already within an existing domain, especially on group policies, etc. So be careful when adding a server to an existing domain that you select the correct function level for your forest and your domain. Being a new domain controller, you will automatically have to install DNS server, which we have already added along with the original installation. If you did not add it originally, during this process the DNS server will be installed, and because this is the first domain controller on the network, it will also automatically be a global catalog server, which means it will process logon requests and you will be unable to uncheck these options. You can also add read-only domain controllers to a network, especially useful when you have domain controllers out in the field where you don't want users or administrators fiddling and changing settings, resetting passwords, or making changes to group policies, etc. You could activate the read-only domain controller functionality, which will allow a domain controller on site to authenticate your users, but you will be limited to the amount of changes you can physically make to the domain. Seeing as though this is the first domain controller in the network, you cannot make it a read-only domain controller. Next, you will be prompted for a password. Now this password is a password which you would use in the event of your domain becoming corrupt or failing. Being best practice always to have more than one domain controller. Specifically for that reason, you shouldn't be using this unless it's a disaster. It's more like a disaster directory services restore mode password. You would only really need to use this password in the event that you have no other existing domain controllers on your network from which you can replicate a fresh copy of the domain. So therefore, note this password. It is very important nonetheless, but once you've set up your first domain controller, you should be setting up a secondary domain controller with a copy of your domain just in case you have any corruptions, in which case you wouldn't need this password. But nonetheless, it's a requirement for the installation. So choose a password, keep it nice and secure, keep it safe, and then let's click on next. In the next window, you will be prompted to specify the DNS delegation settings. Now you'll notice at the top here you have a warning that says a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Now, for some wonderful reason, this error always comes up, regardless if there is actually a DNS server already running, whether you're adding it to existing infrastructure or adding new infrastructure. It's one of those wonderful Microsoft errors that gives you an error, doesn't really tell you what to do about it to get it fixed, but you can just go ahead and ignore that error. It's not going to cause you any hassles. Go click on next. Next you'll be prompted for a NetBIOS domain name. Now this is just easy way of explaining an easy way to identify your domain. If you, for instance, had money accounting services.local, you wouldn't necessarily want to type in money accounting services.local every time you adding a computer to the domain. It's much easier just typing money ACC for that way. You could abbreviate this. If it was money accounting services, you could go MAS or anything you feel is appropriate for the name of your domain. it's not directly linked to your base domain, you could, for instance, call this just financial for that matter, even though your base domain name will still remain money.local. So generally the picked name, that the automatically generated name, is acceptable, but you are welcome to change that to suit your specific requirements. We can go ahead and click next. On the next window, you will see the specification of where the Active Directory database files, log files, sysvol, etc. will be stored. Typically, you can just leave this as standard. Makes managing and troubleshooting your domain a lot easier, because all the Microsoft Knowledge Base articles reference these specific paths. But depending also on your security practices and the requirements within your domain, you are able to change these by clicking on these browse buttons and then pointing to the new directory. But you can just leave them as defaults, and then let's go ahead and click on next. Here you'll see a rundown of all the settings, your domain name, your NetBIOS name, your function levels, all the options for your domain controller, etc, etc, etc. Just have a squiz through it, ensure that everything is correct as per your specifications. For the little more techno savvy, you could also go ahead and have a look at the view script option. This is a PowerShell script, so if you were to copy and paste this or save this file as a .ps1, install ad.ps1 for instance, you would then be able to install this domain with all of these settings from a PowerShell script. Also useful if you are deploying multiple servers, multiple ADs, etc. You could just take the script, edit it accordingly, and just run it with PowerShell. We're just going to stick to the wizard for today. So if you're happy with all the info that you filled in here, go ahead and click next. The server will now do a prerequisites check on the domain, just making sure you have all the requirements installed, etc. If there are any requirements that need to be installed, it will let you know. You can see at the top here, all prerequisite checks passed successfully, so we don't have any issues. It will give you a notification with regards to from Server 2012, notifying you that Windows NT clients are not compatible with the cryptography algorithms, and it also again warns you about the DNS delegation error, which you can safely ignore. Once you're ready to carry on, let's click next. Let's click the install button. As this wizard runs through, you'll see that it shows you a couple of different objects that it's performing at the top in the progress, doing security, setting up policies, etc., configuring your DNS, etc. There we go, all complete. So you have to be signed out. You are forced to do a reboot after installing the domain controller. So hit the close option and your server will go ahead and do a reboot. There we go, our server has rebooted. Go ahead and log in. This would be the same password you used to specify after your installation. Installing Active Directory remembers the same password you used when you did the initial installation. Server Manager will either automatically open, or you can open it from the taskbar. If you give it a few seconds to refresh the services, you'll see that you now have the Active Directory domain services listed, as well as your DNS services. If you go to Tools, you will also now see that you have all the Active Directory management tools at your disposal to manage your users, your sites, domains, trusts, etc., along with the DNS management tool. And from this point forward, you can then select the appropriate tool you need, and you can start adding your users as you require to your server. That's it. I'll show you some more Active Directory configuration tips in a future video. But there we go. Now you can install Active Directory on a server ready for deployment on your network. Thanks guys, and have a great day.